My father's knee slammed into my chest so hard I heard the crack before I felt the agony, a deep splintering sound that tore through my ribs and sent a shockwave of pain exploding in every direction. Air blasted out of my lungs in a single, useless gasp. When I tried to breathe in again, nothing came, only a burning pressure that made my vision pulse black at the edges. His hands clamped down on my shoulders like steel traps, pinning me to the cold kitchen floor. The smell of his sweat and stale whiskey choking me as much as the weight crushing my ribcage. "It's your fault," he roared. The words spat into my face, flecks of saliva landing on my cheek. My ribs throbbed in time with my heartbeat, each thump a bolt of white-hot pain that stole what little breath I could scrape together. I tried to twist free. The attempt only made his knee grind deeper into the shattered bone, sending lightning through my side and forcing a strangled cry from my throat. My mother stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, watching as though she were observing a neighbor's dog misbehave, not her daughter being crushed beneath the weight of a man twice her size. "You always provoke him," she said flatly. No urgency, no fear, no shame, just a cold dismissal that cut as deep as the injury itself. My head throbbed with the rush of blood, my eyes stung from the heat of rage and the sting of helplessness. Beyond the doorway, Ethan lingered, his face pale but unmoving. When our eyes met, he looked away and vanished, the sound of his retreating footsteps pounding into my skull. My father's grip tightened. "You brought this on yourself," he growled, his voice so close I could feel the vibration in my chest, the same chest now screaming for oxygen. I opened my mouth to speak, to beg, but my voice broke into a rasp that didn't sound human. Every muscle in my body wanted to fight, to claw, to strike. Yet my limbs felt like sandbags, too heavy, too slow, starved of the air that might give them strength. The floor was icy under my spine, my body slick with sweat, my pulse roaring in my ears until it drowned out everything else. Then faint but sharp, the sound of a phone unlocking. Someone moved quickly, shoes scuffing against tile. The front door, creaking movement that caught my father's attention, just long enough for his eyes to flick away from mine. "I am calling 911," a voice shouted from somewhere just out of sight. My father froze, his knee still on my chest, but his face tightening as the words hung in the air. The seconds stretched heavy and taut until the far-off wail of sirens began to seep into the edges of my hearing. That sound was thin at first, then growing, cutting through the suffocating fog in my head. It told me two things at once: that help might be coming, and that the reckoning in this house had only just begun. I grew up in a house where love was measured in obedience, and pain was dismissed as weakness, where my father's word was law and my mother enforced it with silent compliance. My father, a former Marine turned construction foreman, carried the discipline of the military into our home, but stripped it of honor, leaving only control and fear. 6 feet tall, with hands like slabs of stone, he moved through rooms with a presence that made the air feel heavier. My mother was the cold, constant echo of his authority, never raising her voice but cutting deeper with the calculated cruelty of her words. I was the eldest, born 3 years before my brother Ethan, and from my earliest memories, the roles in our family were clear. Ethan was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, whose mistakes were brushed away as youthful mischief, whose triumphs were paraded at every family gathering. I was the problem, the one who questioned too much, who was too sensitive, too defiant, too dramatic. My mother called me a handful in public with a strained smile, but in private it was selfish and ungrateful, and "you'll end up alone if you keep this up." My father's punishments came without warning and without proportion. When I was 7 and fell from the backyard oak tree, I ran inside, crying, clutching my wrist. He looked at me then, at the sink full of dishes, and told me to finish washing them before we would go anywhere. By the time he took me to urgent care hours later, my wrist was swollen and bruised, the bone fractured clean through. The doctor said I was lucky there was no permanent damage from the delay, but at home, the only thing my father said was, "That's what happens when you're careless." At 12, I sprained my ankle during a soccer game. He made me walk home the mile from the field, refusing to let anyone give me a ride, saying, "You need to learn to push through." I limped for 3 days before my mother reluctantly took me for an x-ray. At 15, a high fever left me barely able to stand, but the day coincided with one of my father's annual barbecues. I was told to help set up the tables, slice vegetables, and smile for the guests. When I collapsed in the kitchen, my mother accused me of faking to get out of work. The pattern was consistent. Pain was an inconvenience to them, illness, a sign of weakness, injury, something to be brushed aside, or worse, mocked. My father believed he was making me tough, but what he was really doing was teaching me to doubt myself, to ignore my own body, to second-guess every instinct that told me something was wrong. Ethan never faced the same treatment. When he twisted his ankle in gym class, my mother drove him to the ER, immediately fussing over him for weeks. If he had a headache, my father told him to lie down and rest. I saw these differences, and they festered inside me like an untreated wound. My mother's criticisms were relentless and precise, aimed to undermine without leaving marks. She would comment on my clothes. "That outfit is certainly a choice," or my body. "Are you sure you should eat that?" Each remark delivered with a sugary tone that made it impossible to call her out without seeming oversensitive. She told me more than once, "You have to learn to live with men like your father. This is the real world." When I was 19, the first time I ever tried to stand up to him in front of relatives, he slapped me so hard my ears rang for minutes. Everyone at the table froze, then looked away, and my mother's only comment was, "Well, you did provoke him." College was my first taste of freedom. I moved 300 miles away and learned what it felt like to be believed when I said I was sick or hurt. My friends didn't demand proof of my pain. They simply offered help. My professors gave extensions without interrogation. I began to imagine a life where my worth wasn't determined by how well I could endure neglect and abuse. But after graduation, the weight of student loans and a shaky job market forced me back home. My father offered me the apartment above the garage until you get back on your feet, but it came with conditions, chores, errands, and an expectation of gratitude for his generosity. My mother resumed her constant assessments of my appearance, my attitude, my worth. Ethan still lived in the main house, coasting on a job my father had secured for him. Every meal was a test, every conversation a minefield, and I had learned the hard way that in this family there was no such thing as being hurt without being blamed for it. By the time the night in the kitchen arrived, I had spent 27 years under the same lesson: if you are in pain, it is your fault, and the only acceptable response is silence. When I came back from work one Tuesday evening, my father was in the living room with Ethan, both of them laughing over something on the television. The sound felt foreign to me, like it belonged to a world I was not invited into. My father turned the volume down and told me we would be hosting a celebration dinner that weekend for Ethan, who had just been offered a managerial position at the company my father used to run. He said it like it was a family victory, but the way his eyes settled on me told me it was also a test. He expected me to plan everything, cook clean, set up the house and yard, and make sure the evening went perfectly. When I reminded him I had my own work deadlines, he shrugged and said, "Figure it out. Family comes first." That week was a blur of demands. My mother handed me a long list of groceries and supplies, pointing out how much more expensive everything was than it had been last year, as if I were somehow responsible for inflation. Ethan, meanwhile, avoided any involvement, claiming he had to focus on preparing for his new role. I cleaned the deck, scrubbed the grill, ironed table linens, and tried to keep up with my actual job in the few hours left each night. By Thursday, I noticed a dull ache in my left side whenever I bent or lifted something heavy. It was not sharp, just an irritating reminder that I had probably strained a muscle while dragging folding tables out of storage. I considered mentioning it to my father, but pictured the look he would give me, the one that said I was wasting his time. So I kept quiet. On Friday morning, while moving a stack of chairs from the garage to the backyard, I stumbled on the uneven step and slammed my side into the doorframe. The breath whooshed out of me, and for a moment I had to brace myself against the wall, waiting for the pain to subside. My mother saw me paused long enough to take in my expression, then said, "Be careful with those chairs. If you break one, you'll have to replace it." I wanted to tell her that something felt wrong, that my side hurt every time I inhaled, but the words died before they reached my lips. That evening, during a quick run to the store for last-minute items, Ethan called to say he had invited several of his friends to the dinner people I didn't know, which meant more food, more seating, more work. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, swallowing the urge to hang up on him. Saturday came, and with it an endless stream of tasks. I set tables, marinated meat-prepped vegetables, and decorated the yard with string lights my father insisted be hung in a specific pattern. Mid-afternoon, while hauling a cooler full of ice, the ache in my side flared into a stabbing pain that made me stop and catch my breath. My father noticed, and his brow furrowed not with concern but with suspicion. "Don't start slacking now," he said. "We're not doing this halfway." I nodded, forcing myself upright, telling my body to cooperate for just a few more hours. As the sun set, guests began to arrive. My father moved among them like a general surveying his troops, shaking hands, offering drinks, bragging about Ethan's new position. My mother flitted from group to group, keeping an eye on me from the corner of her gaze. I knew she was waiting for any sign of failure. Dinner began, and I stayed mostly in the kitchen, ferrying dishes to the buffet table, refilling drinks, cleaning up spills. My side throbbed steadily, each movement aggravating it, but I pushed through plastering on a polite smile whenever someone spoke to me. At one point, Ethan sauntered into the kitchen and dropped a dirty plate into the sink without a word. I asked him to rinse it first, and he laughed. "You sound like Mom, always bossing people around." The comment stung more than I cared to admit. Later, as I carried a tray of desserts outside, I heard my father telling one of Ethan's friends how toughness ran in the family except for me, who was always delicate. The words lodged in my chest, heavy and unshakable. After dessert, my father announced that I would handle cleanup so everyone else could relax. Ethan and his friends moved to the living room to watch a game. My mother sat with a group of neighbors, and I was left alone in the kitchen. I began stacking plates, scraping leftovers into containers, ignoring the sharp twinges each time I reached across the counter. Then, Ethan walked in smirking, holding an empty beer bottle. "Dad says you're moving too slow," he said, leaning against the fridge. I kept my head down, rinsing a dish. "Tell Dad I'm doing the best I can." He laughed again, this time louder. "Your best has never been enough." Something in me tightened, a coil drawn too far. I turned to face him, and in that instant my father appeared in the doorway. He must have read something in my posture because his eyes narrowed. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Nothing," Ethan said quickly, though his smirk remained. My father stepped into the kitchen, and the space seemed to shrink. "If you can't handle a little extra work, maybe you should stop pretending you're pulling your weight." I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, he took 2 quick steps toward me. The sudden movement made me stumble backward, and my side collided with the corner of the counter. Pain shot through me so sharply I cried out. That sound, that one involuntary cry, was the spark that lit the fuse. His face darkened, his jaw set, and he moved faster than I could process, grabbing my shoulders and shoving me hard against the wall. The jolt rattled through my injured ribs, and the breath I'd been clinging to vanished entirely. His voice rose booming in the enclosed space, accusing me of ruining the evening, of making a scene, of embarrassing him in front of guests. And in that moment, with my back against the wall and the pain stealing my breath, I knew exactly where this was heading. The moment his hands slammed into my shoulders, the world narrowed to the crushing force of his grip and the jagged explosion of pain tearing through my side. My back hit the wall so hard, the framed picture beside my head rattled and tilted, and before I could even register the shock, his knee drove upward into my ribs with a precision that felt practiced, a direct hit to where the ache had been gnawing at me for days. A sharp, nauseating crack split the air, and the sound was almost worse than the pain because it told me something inside me had given way. The impact forced me downward, and he followed, shoving me until the cold floor met my spine. His knee pinned me there, pressing into the fresh break like he meant to grind the bone into dust. I gasped, or tried to, but my lungs seized my body, refusing to expand against the unbearable pressure. My mouth opened and closed soundlessly, each attempt at breathing met with the stabbing agony of shattered ribs scraping against each other. My eyes watered and blurred, the ceiling light above turning into a hazy white halo I could barely focus on. Over his shoulder, I saw my mother in the doorway, her face expressionless, her arms crossed as if she were watching a child misbehave rather than a grown man crushing the life out of his daughter. "You always provoke him," she said, the words slicing through the fog in my head, each one dripping with blame. She didn't step forward, didn't reach for a phone, didn't tell him to stop. The sound of her voice, so calm in the middle of my panic, made my chest constrict in a way even the broken bones couldn't. Ethan appeared in the hallway, eyes wide mouth slightly open. For a split second, I thought he might help, but then he looked down, stepped back, and disappeared without a word, the sound of his retreating footsteps sealing my isolation. My father leaned closer, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and sour. "You brought this on yourself," he growled, and the weight on my chest increased, sending another wave of agony through my body. My arms pushed weakly at his thigh, my nails digging into denim, but I might as well have been shoving against a wall. My vision tunneled the edges, going dark, my own pulse thundering in my ears like a war drum. Then, faint and almost out of place, I heard the click of a phone unlocking. It was quick, deliberate, and followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving toward the front of the house. My father's head jerked slightly, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't move his knee. A voice, sharp and commanding, rang out from beyond the doorway. "I'm calling 911. Those words cut through the haze like a blade, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. My mother's eyes darted toward the sound, her mouth tightening, but she still didn't move. My father's weight shifted slightly, just enough to let a thin stream of air into my lungs, but the relief was laced with the burning fire of broken bone. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to rise faint, at first, then louder, closing in. The sound pierced the ringing in my ears, mingling with the pounding of my heartbeat. My father's head turned toward the front door, calculating while his knee stayed planted on me like an unspoken threat. I could feel my body shaking now, the adrenaline failing to mask the raw damage inside me. My breaths came in shallow, ragged pulls, each one costing more than it gave. The sirens grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights beginning to dance across the ceiling as they reflected off the windows. My father finally pushed himself up, the sudden absence of weight almost as jarring as its presence. He stood over me, towering his chest, heaving, his eyes still locked on mine as if daring me to say something. My mother stepped back into the hallway, her face a mask, and in that moment, the front door burst open. Uniformed EMTs and a police officer filled the space, their voices overlapping in brisk, urgent commands. One EMT dropped to his knees beside me, his hands already at work assessing my injuries, while the officer stepped between me and my father. The EMT's fingers pressed gently along my ribs, and even that light touch sent a cry tearing from my throat. Possible rib fractures decreased breath sounds, he called out, his tone clipped. "Let's get her on O2 and ready for transport." As they slid an oxygen mask over my face, the cool rush of air was almost enough to make me cry from relief. My father stood frozen, watching, his jaw tight, as if the presence of outsiders had rendered him powerless. My mother retreated further into the hallway, her silhouette shrinking as the chaos of rescue overtook the room. And as they lifted me onto the stretcher, the flashing lights spilling across the walls, I realized this was the first time in my life that someone had seen the truth with their own eyes and could no longer be told it was my fault. The oxygen mask pressed cool and firm against my face, the steady hiss of air filling my ears as the EMT adjusted the straps. Each breath came easier now, though the stabbing pain in my ribs made me flinch with every inhale. They lifted me smoothly onto the stretcher, the ceiling lights of the house sliding past above me as they wheeled me toward the front door. My father stood off to the side, his fists clenched, jaw, rigid eyes following every movement, but his body rooted in place as if the arrival of uniforms had stripped him of control. My mother lingered near the hallway, her arms crossed tightly, refusing to meet my gaze. Outside, the night air hit me with a chill that made my teeth clench. The sirens were louder here, the flashing red and blue lights painting the neighborhood in jolting bursts. Neighbors stood on their porches, some whispering to each other, others just staring. I could see recognition and curiosity in their faces, the kind that would travel through the neighborhood by morning. The back doors of the ambulance opened and the EMTs lifted me inside, their movements practiced and efficient. One of them, a tall man with a calm voice, knelt beside me and began attaching monitors to my chest. Oxygen saturation is low, about 82%. We need to keep her stabilized until we get to the hospital, he said to his partner. The other EMT started an IV. His gloved hands working quickly as he asked me about allergies, medications, any prior injuries. I tried to answer, but speaking more than a few words at a time made my chest seize. Broken ribs, maybe lung involvement? The first EMT muttered as he listened to my breathing through a stethoscope. Breath sounds are diminished on the left. Could be a pneumothorax. My mind latched onto the unfamiliar term, and even in my dazed state, I understood it meant something dangerous. The vehicle jolted as we began moving, the siren's wail rising again, and I closed my eyes against the spinning sensation. The EMT's voice stayed steady, grounding me. We're about 10 minutes out. Stay with me, Abigail. Keep breathing steady. My vision blurred with tears, not from the pain alone, but from hearing my name spoken with genuine concern. Something so rare from a man's voice in my life that it almost hurt more than my ribs. He adjusted the oxygen flow, and I felt a faint easing in the tightness of my chest. As the ambulance sped through the streets, he relayed information over the radio to the hospital. 27-year-old female, multiple rib fractures, decreased breath sounds on the left, possible internal injury, oxygen saturation in the low 80s, vitals otherwise stable for now. Prepare trauma bay. When we arrived, the back doors swung open to bright fluorescent lights and a flurry of motion. The gurney wheels clicked over the threshold as they rushed me down a hallway lined with rooms and curtained bays. Doctors and nurses closed in, each taking a task, removing the oxygen mask briefly to check my airway, palpating my abdomen, shining a light in my eyes. A nurse cut away my shirt, and the cool air hit the bruised skin of my side, already mottled purple and blue. We need a chest x-ray stat, a doctor ordered, and page surgery just in case. Within minutes, portable imaging equipment was wheeled in, and a technician gently positioned me for the scan, careful not to jostle my injured side. The images appeared on a nearby screen, and the doctor studied them with a grim expression. 3 fractured ribs on the left side, he said, pointing to the ghostly lines of bone. There's also fluid buildup in the pleural cavity, likely blood from internal bleeding. We'll need to insert a chest tube to prevent further lung collapse. My stomach turned at the words chest tube, but before I could react, they were prepping the area with antiseptic. The nurse explained in a calm voice what would happen: a small incision between the ribs, a tube inserted to drain the fluid and allow my lung to re-expand. The procedure was quick but excruciating, a deep, invasive pressure followed by a rush of relief as the fluid began to drain. My breathing eased fractionally enough to feel the oxygen flowing into me more fully. As they secured the tube and covered it with a sterile dressing, the doctor met my eyes. You're lucky, Abigail. If this had gone untreated much longer, you could have lost consciousness and gone into respiratory failure. I thought of my father's knee pressing into my chest, my mother's cold voice telling me I provoked him, and the silence of my brother watching me suffocate. Lucky was not the word I would have chosen. A police officer entered the trauma bay as the team finished their work. He introduced himself and asked if I was able to answer a few questions. I nodded slightly, and he began with simple details, my full name, the events leading up to the injury, the identities of the people present. I told him everything I could between breaths, each sentence punctuated by a wince, as my ribs reminded me they were broken. The EMT who had treated me in the house came in briefly to hand over his written report, his voice low but firm, as he confirmed the severity of my condition upon arrival. The officer made notes, his expression unreadable, but his pen moving steadily. Once he left, a nurse adjusted my pillows and covered me with a warm blanket. The monitors beeped softly in the background, their steady rhythm strangely comforting. For the first time that night, I let my eyes close without fear of what might happen if I did. I was in a place where the pain was seen, named, and treated, where no one suggested it was my fault for existing in a body that could be hurt. The next morning, the hospital room was filled with the pale light of dawn filtering through the blinds, the quiet punctuated only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the faint hiss of oxygen from the nasal cannula. My chest ached with every breath, the ribs protesting even the smallest movement. But it was a clean pain now, not the sharp, suffocating agony from the night before. A nurse came in to check my vitals and help me sit up slightly, warning me to move slowly. As she adjusted the bed, I saw a shadow fall across the doorway, and my pulse quickened not from pain, but from recognition. My father stepped in first, his presence heavy, his shoulders squared as though he owned the space. My mother followed her arms, folded, her expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke, the silence thick enough to press against my skin. Finally, my father broke it. "You made quite a scene last night, Abigail," he said, his tone more accusatory than concerned. I stared at him, trying to decide whether to speak or let the weight of my gaze answer for me. My voice came out rough but steady. "I didn't make a scene. You broke my ribs." His jaw tightened, the muscle twitching, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he glanced toward my mother as if expecting her to back him. She did. "You've always been dramatic," she said, her voice sharp. "You push him, you provoke him, and then you act like the victim." The words landed like cold water, not surprising, but still enough to make my stomach twist. I could feel my heart rate climbing the monitor, betraying my anger with its quickening beeps. I turned my eyes back to my father. "If provoking means breathing in the same room as you, then sure, I provoked you." He took a step closer to the bed, and for a second I saw the same flicker of rage that had been in his eyes before he pinned me to the floor. But here in this room, with the steady stream of hospital staff moving past the open door, his power was muted. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You think this will save you a hospital report? The police. You're still mine, Abigail." That last sentence, his attempt at a reminder of control, landed differently this time. It didn't tighten around my chest like it used to. It sparked something steady, cold, and deliberate inside me. I met his eyes without flinching. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not yours anymore." My mother scoffed, stepping forward. "You'll come home when you're discharged. We'll sort this out as a family." The way she said family made it sound like a prison sentence. I kept my voice level. "I won't be coming back." My father's hand twitched like he wanted to reach for me but stopped himself, his knuckles tightening instead. He smirked, but there was no confidence behind it. "You'll regret this," he said, his tone dripping with certainty. I let the silence answer him, my gaze fixed on his until he looked away first. The nurse reappeared, then stepping into the tension without hesitation. "Visiting hours are over for now," she said, her voice firm but polite. My father straightened slowly, my mother's lips thinning, but neither argued. They left without another word, the sound of their footsteps fading down the hall. The nurse glanced at me once they were gone, her expression softening. "You don't have to let them in if you don't want to," she said. "We can put it in your chart, restricted visitors." Something in my chest loosened, not in a physical way, but in the sense of a door cracking open. "Yes," I said. "Please do that." She nodded, making a note on the clipboard before adjusting my blanket. Once she left, the quiet returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the suffocating silence of my parents' house. It was space to think, to plan, to remember that my father's words about still owning me were nothing but air. For the first time in years, I realized that his control had limits, and those limits were right here beyond the reach of his hands and his voice. The police officer from the night before came by a little later, notebook in hand. He confirmed that he had filed the initial report and that a detective would follow up. "Your injuries are documented and the EMT's statements match your account," he said. "If you want to press charges, you have a solid case." I nodded slowly, the weight of that possibility settling over me. I wasn't ready to say yes out loud, not yet, but the thought of holding my father accountable was like tasting air after being underwater too long. After he left, I closed my eyes and let the beeping of the monitor steady my breathing. This room, this bed, these people who addressed me by my name instead of an insult, they were temporary, but they were mine for now. And in this moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Safety wasn't just the absence of violence. It was the presence of choice. And I was beginning to have one. By the second day in the hospital, the bruises along my ribs had darkened to deep purples and greens, each breath still a reminder of that night, but my mind was sharper now, no longer fogged by pain and adrenaline. I had asked the nurse to keep my parents away, and the fact that I could make that decision without anyone overruling me was both foreign and intoxicating. Detective Harris arrived mid-morning, a tall man in his 50s, with the kind of calm presence that made you feel like you were finally speaking to someone who saw you as more than a problem to be solved. He introduced himself, set a small recorder on the table, and asked me to start from the beginning. I told him everything, how the argument had started over. Nothing more than me refusing to hand over my paycheck, how my father's voice had shifted from loud to lethal, how he'd slammed me to the floor and pinned me with his knees, how the first rib cracked, then another under his weight. I described my mother's cold detachment, the way she'd watched like it was a TV show she'd seen 100 times. He listened without interrupting his pen, moving across the notebook in quick, efficient strokes. When I finished, he asked if I had ever reported anything before. I shook my head, explaining how every time I'd thought about it in the past, my father had found a way to remind me that it wouldn't matter how he claimed to have friends in the police, how my mother would swear I was unstable, how I'd been conditioned to believe that silence was safer. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair. Abigail, you have medical records, EMT testimony, and now a formal police statement. This isn't just your word anymore. That sentence sank deep, pushing against years of helplessness. He then asked if there were any witnesses, anyone I trusted who had seen the aftermath or knew what my home life was really like. My mind went to two people, instantly my neighbor, Mrs. Collins, who had once seen me with a split lip and had slipped me an ice pack without asking questions, and my friend Rachel from work, who had been on the phone with me moments before the attack and had heard my father yelling in the background. Both had told me before that they would help if I ever needed it. I gave their names to Harris, who jotted them down. After he left, I called Rachel. She picked up on the first ring, her voice trembling when she heard mine. I told her what had happened, and she didn't hesitate. "I'll testify," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Mrs. Collins was the same. She even mentioned that she still had the security camera footage from her porch the night I ran out bleeding months ago after another outburst from my father. The idea that these pieces could fit together into something undeniable made my chest tighten, but in a good way this time. The hospital social worker came by later, a woman named Teresa with kind eyes and a blunt way of speaking. She laid out my options: restraining order, safe housing, legal aid. I asked about the restraining order first. She explained the process, how the medical records and police report would strengthen my case. She also reminded me that my father might try to intimidate me into dropping it. I told her I wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. That night, lying in the hospital bed, I started writing everything down, every incident I could remember, every insult, every bruise. I listed dates, descriptions, and anything that could be verified. It wasn't just about this attack. It was about a lifetime of control and violence. The act of putting it on paper was exhausting, but it was also like slowly turning on a light in a room I'd been forced to keep dark. Each memory that had once been a source of shame was now becoming a piece of evidence, a brick in the wall I was building between me and them. By the third day, I had a folder, a literal folder, filled with copies of my medical chart, police statements, and written accounts from Rachel and Mrs. Collins. When Detective Harris returned to collect it, he gave me a look that was part respect, part approval. "You're making this easier for us to get him charged," he said, and I realized that what I was doing wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back in a way my father had never prepared for. The thought made me almost smile. Almost. The moment I was discharged from the hospital, I didn't go home, not even to pack a bag. I went straight to the courthouse with Teresa, the social worker, who had arranged for an emergency hearing with a judge for a restraining order. Walking into that building felt like crossing an invisible line, one my father had spent years convincing me didn't exist, the line between his control and my autonomy. The courtroom was small, almost intimate, with wood-paneled walls and the faint smell of old paper. My father was already there, sitting at a table with my mother beside him, her arms folded, her lips pressed so tight they were almost invisible. His eyes met mine, and for a second I saw the familiar flash of confidence, the look that had always said, "You can't win." But there was something else now, a flicker of uncertainty. The judge, a woman with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet, asked me to tell her why I was seeking the order. My hands shook as I held the paper, but my voice didn't. I described the attack in detail just as I had to the police, every word deliberate, my eyes fixed on the judge instead of my parents. When I mentioned the cracked ribs, the judge's gaze sharpened. When I described my mother's laughter, her expression didn't change, but I saw her pen pause above the notepad. Then came the evidence photos of my injuries taken by the ER staff, the x-rays showing the fractures, the written statement from Rachel, the footage from Mrs. Collins's camera. Each piece landed like a hammer, and with each one, my father's shoulders seemed to drop a fraction lower. The defense he had probably prepared calling me dramatic unstable was crumbling in real time. The judge granted the restraining order without hesitation, her gavel striking the block with a sound that felt like a door slamming shut. My father was ordered to have no contact with me, no proximity to my workplace or the hospital, and my mother was bound by the same terms. They both sat there stiff as if the weight of the order was only just beginning to register. I didn't stop there. While still in the courthouse, I met with a legal aid attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases. His name was Mark, and he had the kind of quiet focus that made you feel like every word you said mattered. I told him I wanted to press charges, not just for the assault, but for the years of abuse that had been swept under the rug. He explained that the recent attack, combined with the documented history I had begun compiling, made for a strong case. The criminal process would be longer and uglier, but it was possible. I told him I didn't care how long it took. For years, my father had made sure I believed that my pain would never matter in the eyes of the law, and now I wanted to prove him wrong in the most public way possible. Over the next week, Mark and I worked like we were preparing for battle. He helped me organize my notes into a coherent timeline, matching my memories with any outside proof we could find, hospital records, witness statements, even old school reports where teachers had noted unexplained injuries. Rachel and Mrs. Collins were both ready to testify, and Detective Harris kept feeding us updates on the investigation. By the end of the week, I had more than just a folder. I had a case file thick enough to make even the most jaded prosecutor take notice. The turning point wasn't just legal, it was emotional. Each step I took in preparing the case made me feel like I was reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't even realized were gone. The fear that had once been a constant background hum was still there, but it was quieter now, muffled by the knowledge that I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had allies, people who saw the truth and were willing to stand with me even if it meant facing my father in court. The night before the first formal hearing, I stood in front of the mirror in the small apartment Teresa had helped me move into. The bruises were fading, the swelling had gone down, but the lines of determination on my face were new. I thought about all the times I had walked into a room and instinctively scanned for my father's mood, all the times I had bitten back words to avoid setting him off. That part of me was gone now. I wasn't walking into his world anymore. He was about to be dragged into mine, the one where his power meant nothing and his voice carried no weight. And that was the thought I carried with me into the next morning as I walked back into the courthouse, my case file under my arm and my head held higher than it had been in years. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were already swarming with people, some from the local press who had caught wind of the case after Detective Harris filed the assault report with a statement about the evidence. I felt their eyes on me as I climbed the stairs, but for once, the scrutiny didn't feel like a threat. It felt like light hitting a moldy corner, exposing what had been hidden for years. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes before a storm. My father sat at the defense table with his lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who kept whispering urgently to him. My mother was beside him, dressed as if she was attending Sunday service, her expression a mixture of defiance and worry. I took my place at the plaintiff's table with Mark, who placed the thick case file between us like a weapon. When the judge entered the room, fell silent, and the trial began. The prosecution started with the ER photos, sharp, unflinching images of my bruised ribs, the swelling, the hand-shaped marks on my arms. They displayed the x-rays on a large monitor, the fractures standing out like stark white cracks against the black background. I could see the jury shift uncomfortably, some glancing at my father, others at me. Then came the video footage from Mrs. Collins's security camera, showing my father pinning me down in the yard, his weight crushing me while I struggled, his face twisted in rage. The sound of my scream, even muffled through the microphone, filled the room. My father's lawyer tried to object, claiming the footage was taken out of context, but the judge overruled him without hesitation. When Rachel took the stand, her voice was steady, each word like a nail sealing a coffin. She described what she saw that day, the way my father's knee pressed into my ribs, my gasps for air, my mother's laughter echoing in the background. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. Mrs. Collins followed her tone sharp as she recounted how she'd called 911, her voice breaking only when she described hearing me beg for him to stop. By the time the prosecution rested, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The confidence my father had worn like armor was cracking his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. When it was the defense's turn, his lawyer tried to paint me as a troubled daughter with a history of exaggeration, bringing up old-school records and twisting them into a narrative of instability. But each time Mark countered with documented evidence, medical records that aligned with my testimony, teacher statements noting my withdrawn behavior and unexplained injuries. It wasn't just a battle of facts. It was a stripping away of decades of lies. The most powerful moment came when Mark played the audio recording from the hospital Teresa had captured it when my mother visited me in the ER. In it, my mother's voice was unmistakable, telling me I deserved it, that I had brought it on myself, her tone dripping with contempt. There was no mistaking the context, no way to twist it into something benign. The jury sat frozen, their eyes flicking between her and me. The press scribbled furiously in their notebooks. My mother's face went pale, her composure finally slipping. By the end of the day, it was clear to everyone in the room that the narrative had shifted entirely. No longer was this a case of a rebellious daughter against a strict father. It was the story of a woman who had endured years of escalating abuse, backed now by evidence so overwhelming that even the defense's most desperate attempts to discredit me fell flat. As the court adjourned for the day, the reporters swarmed the hallway, their cameras flashing. I didn't stop to answer questions, but I didn't hide either. I walked straight through them, my head high, letting them see the bruises that were still fading, the resolve that had replaced the fear in my eyes. I knew those images would be on the evening news and the papers online. I knew my father hated that more than anything, the loss of control over how people saw him. And that more than the trial itself was the beginning of his public unraveling. The second day of the trial began with a tension so thick it felt like you could slice through it. The defense had run out of easy ways to spin the evidence, and my father's face carried the weight of that realization. His usual posture, shoulders back, chin high, was gone, replaced by a slump that betrayed the pressure closing in on him. The prosecution called the medical examiner to the stand, and she explained in meticulous detail how the fractures in my ribs could only have come from a concentrated, sustained force, not an accident or a fall. She pointed to the specific areas of damage on the x-rays, explaining how the bruising patterns matched being pinned down by someone's body weight. The jurors leaned in as she spoke her words, building a wall of science against the defense's flimsy arguments. Then Mark brought me to the stand. My heart hammered as I raised my hand for the oath, but once I started speaking, the fear began to dissolve into something sharper resolve. I told them everything. Not just about the day he broke my ribs, but about the years leading up to it. The silent dinners where one wrong word could spark an explosion, the countless times my mother stood by or joined in the way my father used physical force, as if it were a language only our family spoke. I didn't cry, not this time. I spoke with the clarity of someone who had been silenced for too long and now refused to lose her voice again. When the defense attorney tried to rattle me with rapid-fire questions suggesting I had provoked my father, questioning why I hadn't reported him sooner, I met his eyes and answered without hesitation. Because when you grow up thinking pain is normal, you don't know it's abuse until someone shows you otherwise. The words hung in the air, and for the first time I saw several jurors glance at each other with something that looked like recognition. Mark ended my testimony with the photo of me in the hospital bed tubes running into my arm, my side wrapped in bandages. It wasn't gruesome, but it was undeniable. The defense tried one last desperate move, calling my mother to the stand. She walked up in her neat blouse and pearls, her voice syrupy sweet, as she claimed I had exaggerated, that my father was only restraining me after I lashed out at him. But the damage was already done. The jury had heard her voice on the recording dripping with cruelty. They had seen her laugh in the video while I was pinned to the ground. Every word she spoke only deepened the contrast between the image she wanted to present and the truth they had already seen. By the time she stepped down, the room seemed to collectively know where the verdict would land. When the judge announced that closing arguments would be heard the following morning, I felt the shift in my bones. We weren't just close to the end of the trial, we were close to the end of my father's control over the story over me. This was the moment the balance of power began to tip, and I wasn't about to let it tip back. The courtroom was packed when we returned for the final day. The air buzzed with anticipation, a mix of reporters ready to file their headlines and members of the community who had followed every twist of the trial. My stomach churned, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was a fierce readiness for what was about to come. Mark's closing argument was a masterclass in precision. He didn't shout or wave his arms. Instead, he spoke steadily, walking the jury through the evidence like a path they couldn't turn away from. He replayed the audio of my father roaring, "It's your fault!" the sound cutting through the silence of the room. He showed the still frames from the video of him pinning me down, my face contorted in pain, my mother standing behind him with that cold smirk. He reminded them of the medical examiner's testimony, the x-rays, the witnesses who had nothing to gain by lying. Then he said something that stuck with me. This case isn't just about broken ribs, it's about a lifetime of domination and fear, and today you decide if that ends. The defense tried to counter painting my father as a strict but loving parent, a man pushed to the edge by a difficult child. But their words felt hollow against the mountain of proof. When the jury left to deliberate, the room exhaled in unison. Hours passed, each minute stretching into an eternity. I could see my father's hands fidgeting, for the first time his knuckles no longer clenched in power but twitching in nervousness. My mother kept whispering to him, her eyes darting toward the doors, as if she could will the jury to come back with the answer she wanted. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. My chest tightened as they filed back in, faces unreadable. The foreperson stood and read the words I had dreamed of hearing but never thought possible: guilty on all counts. The sound was like a crack in the air, sharp and final. Gasps rippled through the spectators. A few people even clapped before the judge banged the gavel for silence. My father didn't flinch outwardly, but his eyes shifted toward me, and for the first time in my life, there was no dominance in them, only the hollow recognition that he had lost. The judge's sentence came next: 15 years, no possibility of parole before 10, and mandatory participation in a rehabilitation program for domestic abusers. My mother's mouth fell open, her composure fracturing as she realized she would no longer have him to shield her from the consequences of her own actions. Reporters swarmed outside as we left the courthouse, their cameras flashing microphones thrust forward. Mark shielded me, but I answered one question, my voice steady. I told them that the verdict wasn't just justice for me, but for anyone who had ever been silenced in their own home. The headline the next morning splashed my father's name across every local paper, the story spreading online with the speed of wildfire. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages, some apologizing for not stepping in sooner, others thanking me for speaking up. The grocery store cashier, the librarian, even people from my high school reached out. The public consequences weren't just legal, they were social, financial, and deeply personal. My father's business contracts evaporated, my mother's social circle shrank overnight, and for the first time, the power they had wielded for so long was gone. In the weeks after the verdict, my life shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first morning I woke up without the looming threat of my father's presence. The sunlight spilling across my bed felt different, warmer, freer, as though the air itself was lighter. I moved into a small apartment downtown. Nothing extravagant, but entirely mine, with locks, only I had the keys to, and walls that didn't echo with shouting. I bought a second-hand couch, a kitchen table from a thrift store, and a bookshelf I filled with both old favorites and new titles I had never allowed myself to read when home was a battleground. Every item I brought in was a deliberate choice, a silent act of reclaiming my autonomy. Therapy became part of my routine, not just to process the violence, but to untangle the years of psychological chains my parents had wrapped around me. Some sessions left me drained raw from reliving memories I had buried, but slowly I began to see the patterns for what they were: control disguised as love cruelty masked as discipline. My therapist reminded me that recovery wasn't a straight path, and on the days when the nightmares returned, I learned not to see them as setbacks, but as steps toward healing. The media attention faded with time, replaced by smaller ripples of change. A local support group for survivors of family abuse reached out asking if I would share my story. Standing in that community center, surrounded by faces that carried their own versions of my pain, I spoke without notes, letting the truth flow without shame. Some cried, some nodded silently, but all understood in a way outsiders never could. That night, I realized that speaking out was more than catharsis. It was a way to chip away at the silence that protected abusers. My father wrote from prison once a short letter that alternated between denial and half-hearted apologies, but I didn't respond. My mother called twice, leaving voicemails that began with accusations and ended with pleas. I deleted them without listening to the middle. I had made my choice. Their voices no longer had a place in my life. Financially, the compensation from the civil case allowed me to cover my expenses without fear, but I was determined to build something of my own. I enrolled in night classes for criminal justice, fueled by the idea that maybe I could help others navigate the legal maze I had just survived. Every lecture, every page of study notes felt like another brick in a foundation I was laying for a life entirely separate from theirs. Months passed and the seasons changed. One crisp autumn afternoon, I walked through the park, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and felt a quiet contentment settle over me. I wasn't naive enough to believe the scars, physical or emotional, would ever fully disappear, but they no longer dictated who I was. My story was no longer one of just survival, but of reclamation. I had taken back my voice, my safety, and my future. The fear that had once been my constant companion had been replaced by something stronger, an unshakable certainty that I could face whatever came next. And as the wind rustled through the trees carrying with it the faint scent of change, I knew that this wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the deliberate beginning of another one I was writing entirely on my own terms.